Okay. All right. More people streaming in. Okay, officially here. Welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. We gather here every Saturday to meet with and learn from the most fascinating and knowledgeable folks in the piano world. We get manufacturers, rebuilders, musicians, makers of other instruments, of course, piano techs. Our mutual goal is to become better at our craft, to help each other, and to create an ever more musical world together. Piano Tech Radio Hour is brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, an online learning resource that brings you cutting-edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. You can find out more at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com. If you're joining us on the socials, I popped the Zoom link there in the chat, so you can hop in and be a part of the show today. And without further ado, because we're starting a little bit late because of Zoom technical difficulties, I'm going to share with you a lecture in our archives with David Clavins, a pioneer in the piano industry, really pushing things forward by creating sort of new and innovative designs. So I think you're going to enjoy me taking a moment to share some of his lecture with you. You can hear about his thoughts, ideas, and his processes as well. It's a fun one. Okay, so let me get rolling on that. We're going to share this. Beautiful. And let's get into about 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, cool. Well, and I go ahead and launch us off with this lecture. I'll introduce our guest, spotlight him here so you can get a good look at his pretty face. And I'll introduce David Clavins. David Clavins accomplished his degree as a master piano builder in January 1980 in Stuttgart, Germany, after having founded his first piano company in 1976 in Bonn, Germany. While initially specializing in the rebuilding of older pianos, in the course of his work, he was studying the factors that mainly determine the acoustic characteristics of the piano, and has essentially come up with his own new and iconoclastic brand of piano. So we'll listen to what he has to say. He's going to focus on a relatively recent incarnation of his pianos called the Unicorda. So David, take it away and let me know when you'd like me to pull the presentation up.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be part of this great community and have the opportunity to introduce you to my work. And as Ethan already said, please feel free to ask any questions that come up during the presentation. And we can, after the presentation, we can get back to any subject, like to any slide that I have prepared. Ethan will steer a slideshow where I have bullet points that I will be talking about. And maybe for the flow of the presentation, it may be useful that you note your questions, as Ethan said, in the chat. And I'll be happy to answer each and every one, except political subjects. Please don't ask me about politics. Okay. Okay, Ethan, let's go.
If it's a country that is relatively, what about like, you know, Icelandic politics or something? I don't know. No, just kidding.
Yeah, maybe some country
relatively uncontroversial.
About I don't know anything.
All right, I'll pull up the presentation and we'll get going. 1 sec.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we can start out with the second slide. The first one says what we know, Clavins Pianos, Latvia. So I want to introduce you briefly to the history, how I came about to develop my own pianos, what motivated me, and how that all, so to say, happened. I will not spend too much time on this history, but for clarity of and understanding my approach, maybe it's not bad. So apprenticeship from 1971 till 74 at the Schimmel company in Germany, Braunschweig, which back then was the biggest industrial manufacturer of pianos. And at Schimmel, I was, like the apprenticeship in Germany goes, you learn everything basic about the piano. But essentially, I knew only the Schimmel pianos and my mother's old piano at home. So that's why I joined the workforce at the piano store right after I finished my apprenticeship in 74, and was working 2 years as a tuner and technician, and learning about all the various pianos that are out there. And it was quite many surprises among that. One of the surprises was how many old, fine looking and great sounding pianos there were that I had never heard about, all kinds of brands that didn't exist anymore. Or also the well-known brands that still, like old Seiler pianos, for example, that seemed to me nicer than the present ones, including the Schimmel pianos. And so while I was working at the piano store, I noticed that the dealers that was in Bonn, Germany, that the dealers actually disregarded all the old pianos. Essentially, they were very keen to sell new pianos, and it was a good time. The new piano sales were developing at a hefty pace, you could even say. And so none of the shops were really interested in doing repairs or rebuilding old pianos. And when I found out that this is the case, I then decided to become self-employed, establish my own piano workshop in 1976 after 2 years of working at the Fischer piano store in Bonn. And focusing on rebuilding of old pianos was a good decision. I more or less, from the get-go, I had lots of clients, and the business developed at a really nice pace. Actually, pretty soon I had more to do than I could accomplish. Next slide, please. And while I was doing the repairs, and that was also one factor why I hardly could accomplish all my orders, was that from the beginning I was investigating very in-depth what each piano that came into my workshop. I was very curious to find out what's the differences of this piano compared to the pianos I knew or I had already seen. And in particular, as we were doing total rebuildings like new strings, new pin blocks, new actions, every second or third piano I was tearing apart completely. And when I was doing that, I was spending a lot of time into measuring, analyzing what I had in front of me. And before I dismantled the piano, I always were doing very thorough sound checks. I mean, trying to evaluate the sound before and after, of course. And in this regard also, then I came across a variety of soundboard designs. I mean, different thicknesses, different shapes. Of course, they were not essentially very different, but in detail, you could say there was quite a variety, different ribs, different spacing of ribs, etc., etc. And one of the first things that caught my attention was studying string scales, because I found that on many old pianos, but as well as on modern pianos, in particular the bass strings sounded this was not a good sound, dissatisfying, sounding kind of muddy and not clear enough in my view, or to my ears. So, and studying string scales was one thing that was a teamwork with a peer of mine, a colleague who had finished piano building at Schimmel also. And he was studying sound engineering at the Düsseldorf University. And since Düsseldorf was close to Bonn, so we were closely cooperating. And he was a theoretical guy and I was the practical side. So what we discussed often what factors we want to investigate. And he was putting up the formulas and I was checking it out practically. What difference does it make if you change string scales? And yeah, next slide, please.
I'll interject one question that came along the way here from Alan Eder. He said, in your rebuilding shop, did you also replace soundboards?
Yes, later on, not in the beginning. I was not daring to, before I had experience in such important matters, to tear apart the soul of the piano, so to say. I was trying to avoid it. From the onset, I did the typical repairs like cutting out and laminating wedges into the cracks of the soundboard. But only later on, when I would say 3-4 years into my work, I was daring to get to the soundboard itself. So this is the next slide, yeah. Yeah, while we were doing the studies with the string scaling, I in particular, or we together with my friend, found out that the inharmonicity at bass strings, what we learned at school while we were learning piano building, was pretty much totally off track, not according to the reality. And in particular, the fact that we found out that the variable, that the inharmonicity is rather a variable, not a constant. And that's, I will explain with the next slide, but that's one major, let's say, difference in understanding, which relates also to tuning the piano. If it's understood at a constant and you, let's say, analyze your strings and you find out that and that inharmonicity, and so you go by that and you don't wonder anymore. But in actually the let's say once you have set and defined the scaling of the piano, or let's say in the case of an old piano, you would restring the piano according to the old measures, then anyway, whatever inharmonicity you have got, you have to go with it. And in this regard, we found out also that the significance of the percentage load is rather more important than the inharmonicity. By means of inharmonicity differences, you hardly hear by ear. You can measure them, of course, but the influence of the percentage load of the strings on the sound character typically is way more influential on the final, so to say, balance of sound at the piano. Next slide, please. So, and here to touch that inharmonicity subject a little bit more in detail, the factors that determine inharmonicity, first of all, of course, is the steel-copper relation, the core, how thick the core is, the core diameter in relation to the copper. And one thing that we found out is, that's maybe a common knowledge, but I was focusing on that pretty much, that the thicker, the bigger diameter at the steel core you have, the higher the inharmonicity typically goes. And from this factor, for example, or studying this one factor, I learned that if you want to have as much as possible clarity in the note, and if you have the chance to restring a piano, you should always recalculate the strings and always choose the core being as thin as physically possible, so to say, as it's possible to wind the string. If the core is too thin, then of course you run into the danger of breaking the string during winding if the copper is too thick in relation to the core. So there is some limitations, but the principle, having the core as thin as possible if you want to reduce inharmonicity, that's one very important factor I found out. And then of course the striking point is influencing the inharmonicity. As we know, if you hit the string exactly at the nuts of the sound wave of the particular string, then you have more harmonic partials in the tone, in the string. And if you deviate from that point, you have more dissonant partials in the tone. I will not go into each of these points too much in depth, but we can discuss about it later. And then the velocity of touch, how you hit the string, and in particular, clearly you can hear that at the bass strings of any piano, and in very, very significantly at Steinway grand pianos, because they have this habit to have very thick core steel at the bass strings. And if you in particular go somewhat to the lower bass, and if you hit the string very softly, so as piano, pianissimo, then you will hear pretty much a round, nice tone without too much enormity at all. And the more you increase velocity, the harder you hit, the more you will hear the partials coming in particular also the dissonant partials. So that's another factor that has to be put in the variable, so to say. A naturally hammer material and condition means having, if you have a harder hammer, naturally you have more high partials. If you have a softer hammer, less. That's trivial actually. But also one factor that goes into the variable if you want to get close to the truth of enormity at the piano. But fundamentally, and one of the maybe most significant things we found out to conclude the point about inharmonicity was that the bass inharmonicity, typically if you express it in cent, which actually is nothing else than percent of a halftone, then we were taught at school that the lower bass strings have some inharmonicity of values like 2, 3, 4, 5 cent. And in reality, we found out that it's 30, 40, 50, up to even 100 cent. I mean, a note that you cannot define anymore at all. If you, for example, you take small pianos, and in America in particular, you have these cabinet pianos, the very small ones. And if you hit a bass string there, you will notice that it's just some sound. It's not a tone at all. It's totally impossible to define the tone. And why is it? That's because the inharmonicity is overlaying the basic frequency fundamental so much, so to such a degree that you cannot make out the fundamental anymore. And why is this important? Of course, it has a lot to do with the tuning of the piano. Let's say if somebody had explained me at school that this is a fact, that you get like in part like 100 cent inharmonicity, then of course instantly I would have asked, so how on earth do you tune such a string? But as long as they tell you, yeah, there's 3, 4, 5, and don't worry, so is it, and just go and tune it by whatever principles, you don't wonder. So I found out during my practice as tuner, in particular also doing concert tunings where you try to get as close as to an ideal tuning as possible, I found it very obvious that the inharmonicity in the bass strings is an important aspect to factor in while teaching piano tuning in particular. Because once you know that, then for example, one consequence of this would be that you cannot very much rely on tuning octaves. The octave, for example, is the most forgiving interval at the entire tuning structure. You can tune an octave, like say up to half a hertz closer, narrower or wider, and if you listen to it as an octave, you would say it's fine. It sounds like an octave. And but once you get to the chords, like comparing tenths, double tenths, and fifths, and octave plus fifth, then of course we get to total different understanding of tuning structure. But that's a big subject on its own, actually, and I would like to move on from here. The next percentage load, yeah.
And just
percentage load.
quick questions, interjecting. There's a couple things that came up, and maybe you're going to answer them, but just to make sure. question is, what is percentage load? If maybe there's a definition of it you're going to present,
Yeah.
and a question about safe breaking percentage for bass strings. Does the percent load equal the breaking percent?
Yeah, the typical understanding, and let's say the theory is, of course, not of course, but would be at 100% load, the string is close to breaking. And it's actually a factor that cannot be calculated to 100% because it depends on other factors, whether you can load it to 110%, let's say practically. But in theory, it's the measure 100 would be the breaking point, 0, it has no tension at all. And so the percentage load that is, I don't know who of you is familiar with Stephen Paolello, the French piano builder, who has developed also various different string categories. We will touch that subject a little later. And Stephen has on his homepage, he has, for example, Excel files to calculate scales, and actually the only factor that is relevant in these scales, or that he shows when you change the diameters, like the core and the copper, the only outcome he shows, because it's the most relevant, is the percentage load. And so that's also by his approach. It's similar to my approach. The most significant factor to determine the scaling that's later, when you listen to the piano, that's as balanced as possible by means of the tonal character, in particular from note to note. Let's say if you have, for example, one note that has 50% percentage load, and you would have the next note to it, the neighboring tone, 60%, or whatever jump in the percentage load, then you also, you hear a significant difference in tonal character. And I mean, one aspect how I think every tuner has come across situations where you have, for example, an old piano that hasn't been tuned for decades, and it's altogether lower, and you have certain notes that are way lower. And you listen to these notes, then you always hear clear, or the same with the new piano if you string it, and while has a very low percentage load, you hear a totally different sound character compared to once you put the string on pitch, so to say. And that in itself also is an interesting subject to discuss, and in particular to experiment on which or what kind of percentage load gives what kind of result. And it also, of course, has to do with the question, what do you want? Do you want a loud piano, as loud as possible? Do you want a soft or rather muted sound? Whatever the goal is, so to say. That also influences, of course, the decision how to decide which percentage load you would like to go with. But in general, talking about the balance of tonal character, my understanding, at least to my experience, I found also out that that's really the most important factor to pay attention to, what percentage load the strings have from bass to treble. And there we come also, we will talk about Stephen Paolello a little bit later, but just to touch, not in depth, but one important, interesting factor of defining, or let's say depending depending the sound differs, is of course the impact of string pressure down bearing on the soundboard. And at the factory where I was learning at Schimmel, for example, or also later I understood at other factories, typically they have calculated a certain load, and that's extending the bridge height like 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters or whatever measure, compared to the straight line between both ends of the string termination. And then you get a certain pressure on the soundboard, which typically you cannot change. And that's a pity, actually, because as we know, the soundboard would the wooden material by character may differ significantly from piano to piano. So once you get essentially on average a soundboard that has wider grain and is, for example, essentially softer, then of course this one and the same down bearing has a different tonal result than at a soundboard which happens to have much narrower grain, thus being harder in its F or more resilient. And so that's an interesting factor also adding while I was investigating this aspect, I found, for example, some old pianos that had hardly any down bearing anymore. Surely have come across such pianos, but they sounded as perfect as you can expect, so to say. I was wondering, so how can this piano sound if it has no sound bearing? Down bearing, not enough down bearing, obviously. And there was also one factor that led me to think that there's a lot additional aspects to take in account as the ones that you were taught in school. And then the interesting, for my personal experience, from my experience, one of the most interesting discoveries was the double layer soundboard, which today, to name it, I generally use at all the pianos that I built.
All right. Hopefully that gave you a nice little taste of David Clavins and what he's up to. I put a link into the chat there. He goes on, I believe in this lecture, I'm sorry, it should say Clavins in my note there, to talk about the Una Corda piano, which he has designed. So if you do already know of Clavins, you probably know of his giant pianos, meaning he builds them up on a staircase so that the bass strings can be extra long. And in this case, he had been commissioned recently, and when I say recently, I think before the pandemic, to create an Una Corda piano, which Una Corda meaning it only has one string per note, but it's not up on a staircase per se. It's actually a smaller piano. It's about the size of a small upright piano, maybe even smaller because of certain design elements that he chose to utilize. So if you're interested in learning more just about that piano, I put the link for the Una Corda into the chat there, so you can check that out. If you want to get deeper into that lecture, I also put the link so that you can purchase it. And beyond that, really appreciate you guys joining today on New Year's Eve. I want to say Happy New Year to everyone that's here today. And appreciate you being here. I appreciate you being part of this whole journey with us. And I'll give our official sign off here for Piano Technicians Masterclasses, because we have reached the end of another musical journey today at Piano Tech Radio Hour. And want to give a thank you to David Clavins for recording this lecture with us and sharing his intelligent perspective with the community. As always, what we're doing here is brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses. That's cutting edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. And those that joined us today for just this session, you can make your life more convenient. You could subscribe to PTRH, just $16 a month. You get the recording of the session in our member area, as well as automatic registration for each week's new session. And you can sign up at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com/PTRH-direct access. And that will pretty much be all for today. I hope you all have a wonderful New Year's Eve, and you're looking forward to a prosperous and exciting new year. There's a lot of potential in the air for all of us, and look forward to seeing what everybody builds. Okay, thanks a lot, folks. We'll see you later.